Hello and welcome to Jamf's webinar, How to Enable Shared iPad in Education. My name's Dave Saltmarsh. I'm one of the presenters today, along with Sam Weiss, our educational evangelist, and we have a systems engineer on hand, Tim Wilmore, who's helped us with getting ready and will be helping us to answer questions as we go forward. We're going to spend a little bit of time today, and I mean a very little, going over a Jamf overview. A lot of these webinars, we have our customers joining us, and if you're new to Jamf and you want to hear more about us, I can point you to places, but we'll spend a little time. What we really want to dive into is what is the new shared, and I like to say it with a personalized, shared iPad experience. And we'll also dive into exactly what you need to do within Jamf Pro to enable the shared iPad. The first thing I want to do is, and when you're not in a live audience, it's really hard to know who's there, and we wouldn't mind adjusting if we could as we go because we have expanded Jamf's usage well beyond IT roles within organizations. So I've just enabled a poll, and maybe you're an instructional specialist or even a building principal or a media or library specialist, and you may be the primary technical contact. I'd love to know what your role is in your organization. And you could also fill in, if you'd like to, if you're using Jamf Pro, just kind of give us that idea. But we also know some people are just here just to understand the concepts of the new shared model for iPads. And you can continue taking that poll throughout the webinar if you'd like to. Jamf, a little bit of our overview. For those that don't know, we help organizations that have Apple products succeed. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're limited to the focus of what the IT staff need. It's really about what is the mission of your organization. And as an educator for 20-something years, that's about learning, helping students, all students, especially with personalizing that experience. And if there's an element of device management that we should really emphasize, it's about giving lots of people access. We certainly could spend many hours here talking about how we help ease deployment and getting devices ready and getting the apps and the other content that they need on them ready for users. But a big part that I like to mention that you may not have really heard us emphasize before is we certainly support the IT groups managing Apple devices, and we put out 4 years ago a Casper Focus that took management all the way down to the classroom teacher. And today we support Casper Focus, but also Apple's tool, Apple Classroom. The key thing to think about is we support all the roles in between those. So we can give access to any one of our capabilities within Jamf Pro down to an individual for just a small set or subset of devices within a school, a building, or even a grade level within a building. So if you don't know much about that, really think about reaching out to Jamf to hear more. Thing is, today, we really want to spend the time talking about the shared iPad experience. And I like to just kick us off with why. As an educator who started off in the late 80s, let's just date me back to there, I remember the one computer in the classroom and having to organize sharing that computer between all of the students that came through my class on a given day. I then migrated up to having some handhelds. And while I was doing that, certainly I wanted to be able to get to a point with logins. And I know a lot of people are focused on students being able to get logins to a device. And, on the Apple side and other platforms, we've had this login. But it gets to being so much more about the experience the students have than just having a segregated, let's say, for their content. And that's absolutely a desire. But because the iPad started providing capabilities that we didn't have in other devices, many of us that started with iPads back in 2010, or maybe iPod Touches before that, went ahead with the perhaps not simplistic way of sharing devices because we saw the value, that experience. And that really is what we're trying to do here, is show you the value of this new thing that can create the iPad, which was originally designed as a, personal device, one-on-one. And we have thousands and thousands, millions even, of students out there using iPads in a one-to-one environment. Now we can give that personalized experience that is beyond logins to being customized, where when they tap on their picture and they go to their area on the iPad, they'll see the apps that are set up for them and also preferences for them. And we can be agile with that. It can change as it needs to. Because as an educator, we know students are learning and they're growing and they're becoming more mature and they're earning privileges. And we want to see, beyond just logins and content, that we can mass customize as students move up a digital citizenship program, that they get more privileges or maybe more access. And what we can end up doing is having one student use an iPad and get these apps, and the next student, maybe they're in a different grade level, gets a completely different set of apps for them. Before I hand things off to Sam, I just want to show a quick overview of the teacher perspective. And I promise he actually goes in really detailed examination to highlight what this really is and how to get it set up. But a teacher actually has the capability with Apple Classroom, and we don't have to have Apple Classroom involved, and we won't be showing all the capabilities of Apple Classroom, but I did want to mention that experience, when a teacher rolls a cart of iPads into their classroom, they can actually tap on a button called Assign, and it will realize who used the iPad last, and it will bring up the photo of that student so that when the devices are handed out, it can be streamlined. And if the student was the last student to use that device and their data is already there, instead of taking maybe a minute or so to bring stuff down, it'll be up and ready for them in a matter of a few seconds. The other capability that teachers have beyond assigning devices is when they're done with the class. Now, when a student goes and logs out, it basically synchronizes their data to whatever site, whether it's iCloud or whatever storage site for the particular app is there. But if they don't do that, it may not happen until the next student goes to log in. And ideally, that would happen at the end of each user's use or experience, just to speed that process up. So within Apple Classroom, a teacher could do that. And that's about it related to shared iPads. However, from the student's experience, this is where it really gets fun. I remember going in and just putting a passcode. I remember working with kindergartners and second graders and teaching them how to use passcodes back in the early 90s. Well, now a student can choose their picture, whether it's from a classroom list or whether it's from a list of who was using the device most recently. The students will see that, in fact, this case I have Alex and Aubrey were the most recent users. Their data is backed up on this device. If they tap their picture, it's going to load up quickly, or somebody can go to one of the other classes and just simply pick their photos. And that's pretty magical for a kindergartner or a second grade student to be able to do. Once they pick their picture, like I said, if they've been on it recently, it's going to come up pretty quickly. But the most important piece for me is once they've put in their passcode, and I do want to reiterate, having worked with all ages of kids, we can actually set it on the back end to be a 4-digit passcode, 6-digit passcode, or a complex passcode, all based upon that user's needs and the preferences you choose. And when they get in, they've got that personalized experience customized down to them. Sam's going to go in and show you a lot more detail of this, and before we get started with that, I'd like to ask another poll question. And this one is related to whether or not you're currently using iPads in a shared use experience. You may have them just as sets where every classroom teacher has 6 or so in their classroom. You may have them on a cart. We call it a trolley over in England. Maybe you're just doing it out of the library. So if you wouldn't mind answering those questions, it would really help us. While Sam's presenting, myself and Tim will be looking at that, and we might be able to add some more commentary as we go. I'm going to pass it off to Sam so he can get into the details for you.
All right. Thanks, Dave. Hello, everyone. Really happy to be back. If you joined my last webinar a few months ago, we were talking about what are some of the most recent exciting changes from Apple when it comes to education. And my favorite one, I was very transparent in my last webinar, is shared iPad. This is a great way for schools to get more use out of their technology. Have students have a more seamless experience when it comes to managing their apps and data. So I'm really excited that we get to dive in today and talk about this in some more detail. So just to start off, the way that we're going to do this today is I'm going to give you a few illustrations on how this really works from a high-level perspective. Then we're going to talk about the requirements to have all this set up, both from an infrastructure and an iPad standpoint. And then lastly, we're going to show you some screenshots from inside the Jamf Pro server on what exactly you would need to do to set this up. All right. So the very first thing, when we're setting up shared iPads, one of the important things to keep in mind is the device itself should be assigned all the apps and all the settings that might be needed by that device. Now, I'm looking at your poll results here, and it seems like the majority of you either have classroom sets or you have carts that you move in between different classrooms. The way to think about this is if you have a cart that's going to be in a 5th grade math, English, and then coding classes, you need to make sure that all of those apps are scoped to that device. So you can see my example. I've got math apps at the top, I've got vocabulary on the 2nd row, and I've got coding on the 3rd row. So first step is preparing these iPads to have all the apps and settings that might be needed. Now this is where the magic happens. Now that we have shared iPad, we have 2 different types of profiles and settings. We have device-based profiles and we have user-level profiles. And this is going to allow us to use restrictions to apply usage restrictions, also known as show, hide apps, and home screen layout to personalize that experience on the iPad. So I do have a few examples. Let's say that we have 3 students that might be using this iPad at any point in time throughout the day. Student number 1 is enrolled in math class. So that student is going to sign into the iPad with his or her managed Apple ID, which we'll talk about in more detail later. And Jamf Pro is going to realize, you know what? That student is enrolled in math. Let's put a user-specific configuration profile that hides all of the apps that are not math. So as you can see, we grayed out the vocabulary and we grayed out the coding apps for that student. Now, after that student signs out and a new student signs in that's enrolled in English, Jamf is going to realize, hey, that student is enrolled in English. We should push a new user-level configuration profile that now hides the other applications. So as you can see, even though the iPad has all of the apps on it, depending on what student signs in, that's how we personalize the experience beyond boilerplate iPad for everybody. And the third example I have is, let's say we have another student that's enrolled in both English as well as some coding courses. Jamf is smart enough to realize that that student is enrolled in multiple classes that have apps on that iPad, and we're actually going to, again, push down a new user-level configuration profile and make visible all of the applications that that student might be interested in. So that student in this particular instance will see apps for both classes. So as you can see, the best way to think about this is step 1 is preparing your iPads. We'll go into much more detail on this. Step 1, preparing your iPads to have all the apps and settings that they might need. And then step 2 is personalizing that experience with those class level profiles. Another thing to think about is, how is storage going to work? When we're using shared iPads, your iPad, if let's just say you have a 32 gigabyte device, is going to it's going to restrict off 8 gigabytes of that space to be solely dedicated to apps. So 8 gigabytes on a 32 gigabyte iPad is going to be reserved for applications, and user spaces are going to be a minimum of 1 gigabyte on a 32 gigabyte iPad. Now, we have the ability to set how many users an iPad will hold at max. And what we do is, after we install the apps on that iPad, any free space that's available is going to be divided equally among the number of users. I have a graphic to show in just a second for this. But what's important to keep in mind is the iPad is going to cache that user's app data up to the maximum number of users. And let's say that's 4. As soon as the 5th student signs on, the iPad will purge the oldest user's profile from that iPad. It is backed up to iCloud, but something to keep in mind is, if that student were to come back, it's going to take a minute or two to pull that information down from either iCloud or your caching server. So here is a graphic example of that. Let's just say we have a 32 gigabyte iPad. After formatting and after iOS, we have about 22 gigabytes free. Now, iOS is going to reserve 8 of those gigabytes for apps. So in this instance, with 2 users, each user space is about 7 gigabytes. If you throw a third user on there, you're looking at just over 4.5 gigabytes for that user space. And if you have a fourth user, you're looking at about 3.5 gigabytes. Now, this is important. Think about it like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just right. You don't want to have too many users on this iPad because then they won't have enough space to work within. You also don't want too few users set up on this iPad. Otherwise, you'll be kicking off profiles and waiting for them to come back down from iCloud frequently. So in my example, let's just say this iPad is set up for 4 maximum users. As soon as that 5th user signs in, the iPad is actually going to purge the oldest user data from that iPad. It is backed up to iCloud, but in this instance, if user 1 attempted to sign back into that iPad, it would work, but the iPad is going to say, please wait while we reload your content. And like I said, that's either going to come from iCloud directly, or we highly recommend if you have many devices using lots of profiles like this, a caching server can certainly decrease the wait time as well as the network bandwidth when we talk about this. So now that we've seen really the two major concepts that are new to iPad, so the user-based profile and storage, I want to show you specifically how do you set up shared iPad with Jamf Pro. So the very first part is going to be some requirements in infrastructure that you need. So the very first thing is you're going to need access to Apple School Manager. Now, Apple School Manager came out of preview earlier this year, and it is your single portal for purchasing content like apps and assigning devices to MDM servers. If you're still going to deploy.apple.com for DEP and VPP, you're going to need to upgrade to Apple School Manager, not just for shared iPad, but there's a wide array of administrative features specifically for schools and Apple School Manager. The next thing that you'll need are managed Apple IDs. And again, this is a new concept. What this is not is it's not the under 13 Apple ID program. This is a program that's made it really easy for schools to create Apple IDs in batches and have those IDs be different so they don't have access to iTunes. They don't have access to the App Store. What they're really best for is this shared iPad environment. So managed Apple IDs, we'll talk a little bit more about the creation of those in a minute, but they are going to be required. That's how your students are signing into these iPads with managed Apple IDs. You will need Jamf Pro version 9.9 or later. Now, Apple School Manager does have updates almost monthly. They have a K-base where you can look at that. Jamf is updating as well, so I would upgrade to the very latest version of Jamf before attempting this. And the last thing that you'll need is DEP setup inside Jamf Pro. Shared iPad requires supervised devices, but beyond supervision, it actually requires these devices go through DEP. Now, before clicking to the next slide, I just want to call out, we have included a lot of resources, both white papers, technical papers, knowledge-based articles from both Jamf and Apple. You'll see all of those listed at the bottom of the slides. In the YouTube version of this, those will be clickable, but we'll also dump the links in the chat window for you to click through as well. Besides just infrastructure, there are also some iPad hardware requirements. So the iPads that are currently eligible for the shared iPad model are the iPad Pro, both the 12.9 and the 10.5-inch model, iPad Mini 4 or later, iPad Air 2 or later, and this does include the new 5th generation or 2017 iPad that you can get for $299 for education. And some other requirements. It does require 32 gigabytes or more, and it needs to be running iOS 9.3 or newer. Now, thankfully, Apple doesn't sell an iPad that's less than 32 gigabytes now. And lastly, you may have assumed this, but these iPads do need to be DEP-eligible hardware because they do need to go through a pre-stage configuration, which we'll show you about in a second, but that does require the DEP process to kick off shared iPad. Now, for managed Apple IDs, there are 3 ways to create managed Apple IDs within Apple School Manager. And they have pros and they have cons. Let me talk you through them. The best possible way to bring student information into Apple School Manager is with direct SIS integration. And the 3 that we know of today that support Apple School Manager or PowerSchool, Infinite Campus, and SunGuard. Now, managed Apple IDs are not simply logins with passwords. It gives us a lot of other information from your SIS, such as what classes is a student enrolled in, what teachers run which classes, which then power the classroom app. So that's why Apple wants to use an SIS system as the basis of this information. It literally has everything that we're looking for. Now, if you do not have one of those SIS systems, there's another option. It's a secure FTP upload. Apple has 6 CSV spreadsheets available on this website that I've linked to as both the blanks as well as example spreadsheets that have already been filled out. But if you have an SIS system that does not support direct import, you can fill out these 6 CSVs and upload them via secure FTP to Apple School Manager and get access to those managed Apple IDs. Now, what's pretty cool, Skyward, if you're using that one, actually has templates where you can click a button and it will export those 6 CSV files in a perfectly Apple formatted fashion. If you don't have Skyward, there is going to be some work to be done to fill out those 6 CSVs and get them to a point where Apple accepts them. But Apple's error logging has gone above and beyond in this process, so they've made it a lot easier to figure out what's gone wrong. So if you've tried that process before and had troubles, one, check out their example spreadsheets because it really makes a lot more things clear. But lastly, just give it a shot again and you'll probably get a more logical error message than last time. And then lastly, you do have the ability directly within the GUI for Apple School Manager to create users and assign them to classes, but that is very much not scalable. So I would recommend doing that if you're testing, if you have an incredibly small deployment, or don't have the other options available to you. So again, direct SIS integration, that's the preferred method. Secure FTP upload, that's your other option to do things quickly, and manual entry, really only good for testing in my opinion. All right. Now, as I mentioned before, think about shared iPads as 2 distinct buckets. First, you have to prepare your devices, and then you need to personalize your devices. I'm about to show you screenshots inside Jamf Pro to accomplish all of these things. But what we're going to do is we're going to enable Apple Education support. Basically tell Jamf, I'm about to use education features. The second thing we'll do is we're going to create a pre-stage enrollment with shared iPad support. And that's going to help us kick off that device wipe, come back online, and know you're a shared iPad. Then we're going to group our cart of devices together to make it really easy to distribute the apps to that device because keep in mind, those shared iPads need every app that a student might need when they encounter it. And it's also going to help us select these devices and specify a class to them. And secondly, to personalize these devices, we're going to use class-level app restrictions, and we're going to use class-level home screen layout to personalize that experience. And lastly, if you're familiar with Jamf, you know we have management commands like wipe passcode, lock device. We have one specifically for shared iPads that we'll show you as well. And with that, let's dive into some Jamf Pro. So the very first thing that we're seeing here, if you were to go to your settings cog under the mobile device management section, the very first thing we're going to have to do is enable Apple Education support. And this does 2 things. It will expose shared iPad in your pre-stage enrollments to select as an option. And it's also going to generate education profiles that power Apple's Classroom app, basically telling that iPad who is your teacher and who can control you. As Dave was showing you in the beginning, we do support student image servers, which powers the ability for students to see their image on the iPad and tap on it for login, as well as power the teacher's view to tap on student images to manage devices through the Classroom app. We're not really going to get too much into that today. It's fairly easy, but we do have links with a white paper on how to set it up. It's really just establishing certificates. It's fairly easy. But the point of today is to show you how to enable these shared iPads. So we're just going to keep moving on. Under the Apple School Manager tab, under Apple Education Support, we need to check this box to enable Apple School Manager integration. And what that does is it's going to say, yes, we actually want to pull in the roster information from Apple School Manager. So you're setting up an Apple School Manager instance, and it would look like this on the inside. So you need to specify which of your DEP tokens is linked to your Apple School Manager instance. Other things down here, you can specify how frequently would you like the JSS to pull in new information from your student or from Apple School Manager. And so you can specify how frequently you'd like that to happen. Everything else that's on this page is really set up to help folks that are either doing a current one-to-one or have teacher devices. We have this concept called matching criteria. If you currently have a user or class structure in Jamf Pro, either for Casper Focus or for teacher devices or for one-to-one devices, this information at the bottom makes sure that we don't overwrite any of those records. If a student already exists inside Jamf Pro, let's make sure that we don't dual import that student's information from Apple School Manager. If you're new to Apple School Manager in Jamf, you don't have to worry so much about that matching criteria. And this is where we really start to make some actions on these devices. The first thing you want to do is you want to create a pre-stage enrollment. Now, for those of you that are new to Jamf or new to managing Apple devices, this is where we tell an iPad that turns on for the very first time, how should you set yourself up? This is how we accomplish zero-touch enrollment. The specific functions that we'd be looking for in a pre-stage enrollment to enable shared iPad, I've blown up on the screen here. First, we want to make sure that these devices are supervised because shared iPad does require supervision via DEP. Next, we want to enable shared iPad. And lastly, this is where you set those maximum number of users. So depending what number you choose here, your iPad is going to take its total free space after iOS and after app installation, and it's going to divide it by this number. So again, this is the Goldilocks theory. Not too many users, not too few users. Too many users and your users won't have enough space. Too few users and those profiles will be getting kicked out to iCloud and downloaded again from either iCloud or your caching server. So again, think through the daily life of this iPad. Think about what classes it might be in. Think about how many users are going to be using it and choose that many. The next thing you'll want to do is you want to create a smart mobile device group for this iPad cart. And what this is going to do, it's going to make it really easy to scope those applications to the devices. And it's also going to make it really easy for us to specify which iPads are shared iPads for which classes in just a slide or two. Now you'll notice I'm doing a smart mobile device group, and I'm choosing my enrollment method pre-stage enrollment is, and then I'm choosing the name of that pre-stage enrollment I previously created. On this screen, this is our app deployment screen. So again, for those of you familiar with Jamf, if you were deploying an app, what you would do is you'd go into scope and you'd say, who gets this app? In this case, again, you can see our target is that smart mobile device group, iPad Cart 1. Again, all just based off of that pre-stage enrollment that these devices used when they booted up for the first time. A little trick here. You want to make sure that you are deploying these apps using device-based volume purchase program. So under the VPP tab, if you were to choose deploy VPP content, that's going to avoid us having to type an Apple ID into this device. So again, we want to make it easy to get the apps down there. Everything that we've done up to this point has been preparing devices for that personalized experience. Now we get to those user level settings or class level settings. Now what you'll see here, we're in the Classes tab of Jamf Pro, and we're looking at an Art and Design class. And you can tell this came directly from Apple School Manager. The few things that I'd really like to point out, here are some things that are required to make these classes work. The very first thing is you need students or a student user group selected. So what students are going to be using this? If you're pulling this in from Apple School Manager, it is going to come in as students. You need a teacher specified or a teacher user group. And again, this is really to power Apple Classroom app, but it is good to have since this information is going to be coming over anyway. And this is what I really wanted to show you. So under mobile device groups, we need to say which of our mobile devices are going to be mobile devices that support the art and design class. And if you were to go in there, you would simply add that smart mobile device group again, so shared iPads or iPad cart. Again, just use that same smart mobile device group that you use based off of the PreStage to get the apps down. That's the same thing you're going to use to specify which iPads are your art and design shared iPads. Now, after that, once we get to personalization, that's really where app usage restrictions or show hide comes in, as well as the home screen layout. And if we were to dive into that app usage restriction, this is how I currently have my art and design class set up. So if a student that was enrolled in this art and design class, so is one of those 33 students listed up top, we are going to push that user level configuration profile down that only shows these 3 apps, and they are all art related classes, or apps for that matter. Now, I do want to point out that Apple TV and meeting times, those are functions of Casper Focus. Apple TV Discovery is done via Bluetooth in Apple Classroom, and meeting time only qualifies for the Casper Focus app. So don't worry too much if you're new to this and only doing Apple Classroom and only doing shared iPad. You do not need to worry about Apple TV or meeting times. And lastly, as promised, this is your management tab. So for those of you familiar with Jamf, this is where you update inventory, lock devices, clear passcodes, and all that fun stuff. We now have log out user. So same as Dave showed you via the Classroom app, a teacher can press a button and log out their users, which initiates a backup to iCloud. Administrators can also log out users from Jamf. Not something that you'd probably do all that often just because students have the ability to do it on their own. Teachers have the ability to do it through the Classroom app. If you're stuck in a situation or just need some technical assistance, the administrators at your school can log out a user from the Management tab. So with all that being said, I know that felt like a whirlwind tour, but that is how you set up shared iPads in Jamf Pro. Just to recap, there's a preparation stage, and that's where you're going to make sure that you have Apple School Manager managed Apple IDs. That's where you're going to set your pre-stages. That's where you're going to create your smart groups to specify apps that go to that device. And then we have the personalization standpoint, which is where we use those class level configuration profiles, primarily app usage and home screen layout to personalize that experience. Now, like I said, we've had some sources and some resources at the bottom of almost every single slide. These are 3 really fantastic high-level overviews of everything that you just saw, but in a printed format so you can go through it at your pace. Again, on the YouTube version of this, these links will all be clickable. That top one is a technical paper from us going through all of these steps. That second link is a blog. One of our systems engineers, Kelly Watkins, put together a fantastic troubleshooting guide, not just for shared use, but also the Classroom app. And lastly, Apple has their iOS deployment guide that's recently been updated with all of this content, including more about managed Apple IDs and Apple School Manager. I'd highly encourage you to read through all 3 of these. Definitely prepare yourself for this endeavor before jumping into it. But for those of you that are Jamf customers, please reach out to tech support or info@jamf.com if you have any questions on how to set this up, and we'd be happy to help you out. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time.